Good morning, Year 10. This week we're going to look at setting in the sign of the 4. That's the physical setting, so the climate, the weather, the buildings, the locations, but also the social setting, so that will be more to do with the rich and the poor in London. Okay, so if you have a go at answering these multiple choice questions, and then we'll go through the answers at the end. Hopefully you'll be familiar now with the assessment objectives, but there they are again if you want to have a look through them. So assessment objective 1 is use of quotations and understanding of the text. Assessment objective 2 is your ability to analyse writers' methods. And assessment objective 3 is relating the text to its context. Okay, so our first point then that we would make about setting is that the gloomy weather in the novella seems to reflect the mystery surrounding the case. So if you have a look then, the quotation that I've chosen is from chapter 3, and we're told that there is a dense, drizzly fog which lay low upon the great city. So as you can see, the assessment objective 1, the point that I would make, is that Doyle uses the smog and the gloom of 19th century Victorian London to suggest that the mystery is hard to navigate through, it's hard to solve. So you can see as a method, Doyle is using pathetic fallacy, where the weather is reflecting the mood of the characters and the mood of the situation. So at this point in chapter 3, early on in the story, the mystery is really unclear and complex. So it's like walking through thick fog. So the fog here represents that the case is nowhere near being solved at this point. Another method that you may wish to refer to is the fact that this motif of fog and gloom is sustained throughout the novella. So a motif is an image that recurs, it keeps cropping up in the text. What you will notice is that throughout the novella, the fog gradually seems to lift, suggesting that the closer they get to the case being solved, the clearer the air is. For assessment objective 3 then, you could talk about the fact that in Victorian times, London was very industrial. So there was lots of smog polluting the skies, and also Gothic literature of the 19th century often included these dark and gloomy settings, so the fog seems to be quite appropriate. Another quotation that you could link to this at the bottom, we're told that the lamps in London are but misty splotches of diffused light at this point, suggesting that the light can't penetrate the thick gloom and fog, in the same way that at this point Holmes doesn't have adequate knowledge or insight to work his way through the case. Okay, so the second point that you could make about setting is that London is a growing metropolis with increasing poverty and crime. So Doyle seems to be exposing this problem of overpopulation in Victorian London, and because of that, lots of terraced housing was increasing. When you get lots of poor people, you also get increased crime, which of course links to the fact that this is detective fiction. So the quotation that I've chosen is long lines of dull brick houses, the monster tentacles which the great city was throwing out into the country. So you can see here that Doyle uses a metaphor of monster tentacles. So that's suggesting that London is growing unnaturally quickly and it's greedily swallowing up the surrounding countryside. So these tentacles, if you think of tentacles on an octopus, it suggests that the lines of terraced houses are winding and weaving their way across the landscape and taking over. So for context, you would just need to say something along the lines of Victorian London was growing at a really rapid rate, and that's because the Industrial Revolution had increased employment opportunities. However, there was also an increase in birth rate, which inevitably increases poverty and social problems like crime. because the city was so densely populated. If you wanted another quotation to link this to, at the bottom there, when we're travelling to Thaddeus Sholto's house, we're taken through a questionable and forbidding neighbourhood, suggesting that in these poorer parts of London, there are lots of suspicious characters in those areas. Okay, so the third point that you could make about setting in the Sign of the Four is that the rich and the poor live side by side in London, sometimes causing friction and problems. So Doyle seems to be exposing this stark divide between the rich and the poor in 19th century London. We know this because when we arrive at Thaddeus Sholto's house in chapter 4, we're told that his home seems to be an oasis of art in the howling desert of South London. So if you look at the metaphor used here, it's suggesting that the interior of Sholto's house, which is rich in all of these Eastern and Oriental luxuries, is in direct contrast to the shabby exterior of the house. So it's juxtaposed against the outside of the house. So from the outside, the house looks really quite poor and it's in this questionable and forbidding neighbourhood. However, when you go inside, because of all the luxuries that Thaddeus Sholto owns and all of the expensive art, it's like an oasis. So an oasis in the desert, if you're unsure, is a place where there would be a water source. So using that metaphor suggests that the interior of this home is a place of refuge or safety or some kind of cultural nourishment. So Thaddeus Sholto seems to hide away in there, and that's where he seeks refuge. And that's in comparison to the deprived surroundings as soon as you leave the house. Now, for A03, looking at context, it seems strange that Thaddeus Sholto, who's quite rich, lives in such a poor area. Well, if you look at the point for A03, corruption at the time amongst the middle and upper classes was rife. So the wealthy were often greedy and immoral, and we see that in Major Sholto in particular. So Thaddeus chooses to remove himself physically from the environment in which he grew up. So he grew up in quite a rich environment, but he's moved away from Pondicherry Lodge because he doesn't want to be associated with that. If you wanted to make some links, Sholto's home is also described using the simile as out of place as a diamond of the first water in a setting of brass. Again, just reinforcing that his home, when you go inside it, seems completely juxtaposed against the outside area. Okay, point number 4 that you could make on an essay about setting is that as pieces of the mystery are revealed, the fog and gloom is slowly penetrated. So Doyle seems to be proving that by following Holmes's method of the science of deduction, light can be shed upon the most complex mysteries. So in chapter 5, when they arrive at Pondicherry Lodge, we're told that heavy clouds moved slowly across the sky, with half a moon peeping occasionally through the rifts. So the light here, the half a moon that's peeping through the clouds, is suggesting that they do now have some knowledge on the case. So the light is a metaphor for increasing knowledge. So the motif of fog again is being used, and that, as we've already said, is a metaphor for the mystery. But like I've just mentioned, this light that seems to be piercing through the clouds and the fog is suggesting that they are gaining knowledge and moving forward with the case. So for assessment objective 3, you might want to talk about the fact that in the 19th century, it was a time of great scientific advancement or enlightenment, which means learning new things. So science was providing explanations for what had previously been inexplicable. So this enlightenment or gaining of knowledge to solve these crimes and mysteries links not only to the science of deduction, but also to these images of light in the novella. So just to clarify, you'll often see Holmes being compared in the novella to things like a glowworm. So he sheds light on the situation. You also see him holding a lamp several times throughout the novella, again suggesting that he is the only one who can pierce the darkness surrounding this case. Okay, so the fifth and final point that you might make in an essay about setting is that natural light is used as a symbol for knowledge and solution of the mystery. So Doyle seems to be suggesting in chapter 10 that clear logical thinking, so the thinking of Holmes, can solve any mystery. So in chapter 10, we're told that it is a clear starlit night. Now, obviously that's very different to the fog and gloom that we see earlier in the novella. So here you can see that the motif of light versus darkness is used again to suggest that by this point they know who the culprits are and the majority of the mystery has been solved. And that's symbolised by juxtaposing the bright starlight, which is a metaphor for their new acquired knowledge on the case, against this backdrop of darkness. So previously they were in the dark, they had no knowledge, they were ignorant of what had happened, and now they have gained lots of knowledge, and that's represented by this bright starlight. A link that you could make here is that in chapter 7, when Holmes feels he's finally making some headway with the case, his mood lifts considerably. And that's symbolised by the fact that he says, "One cloud floats like a pink feather from some gigantic flamingo. Now the red rim of the sun pushes itself over the London cloud bank." So again, you can see these images of light with the red rim of the sun, and the fact that it's pushing itself over the horizon or through the clouds suggests again that knowledge is increasing. So do look out for this motif of light and how it represents increasing information, increasing knowledge. Incidentally, Holmes's observation there about the sun is juxtaposed against earlier in chapter 1 when he was quite depressed. Okay, so for those of you who are going for a grade 7 or above, you may also want to talk about the motif of labyrinths and winding passageways in the novella. So if you have a look at the quotations that I've gathered for you, one of the key ones is this idea of everything being like a labyrinth. So in chapter 3, when they're travelling to Thaddeus Sholto's house, they have to navigate through a labyrinth of streets. Now the word labyrinth is used several times throughout the story, so it does become this motif. Now a labyrinth is a maze, so what that might be suggesting is that the investigation that they've embarked upon is really quite complex. So just when you think you are following one clue, you end up at a dead end like you would in a maze, and you have to turn back and go a different way. So it links to this idea of there being lots of red herrings in the story. So each time they follow one lead, often it doesn't result in anything. So please consider why there are so many labyrinths and so many winding passageways and long corridors twisting in and out. Okay, so another point that you could make if you're going for the higher grades is that setting is not only about physical setting, it's also about social and historical backdrop to the novella. So I've gathered some quotations together here that really show the juxtaposition of the rich in London against the poor. Obviously there were a lot more poor people, but if you have a look at some of the phrases and words that are highlighted in red, so in the first quotation, when they go to the Lyceum Theatre to meet up with Thaddeus Sholto's servant, we're told that there are shirt-fronted men and bediamonded women outside the theatre. So we see how the very wealthy have travelled into the city centre to go to the theatre, whereas outside that theatre, we're told that there are lots of sad faces, lots of haggard faces. So those would be the faces of the poor people, and they're juxtaposed against the glad and merry faces of the rich people. So simple things for you to remember, simple words to learn: sad and glad, haggard and merry, just to show that clear divide between the rich and the poor and the effects their lives have on them. So yes, just have a think about then, in the novella, which of these characters, the rich or the poor, generally are presented to show more loyalty and morality. Okay, so if you think about Major Sholto and Captain Morstan, and then you compare them to people like Mrs. Smith and the Baker Street Irregulars, which characters seem to be more moral and more loyal? Okay, something else which you may wish to explore briefly when you're looking at setting is Jonathan Small's narrative in chapter 11, when he talks about growing up in Worcestershire as a young man. You can see from these quotations here that he talks about things like never being in luck's way and how he was a bit of a rover. It's suggested that he got a girl pregnant possibly, and then he had to join the army. So you can see that he's had quite a working class, quite a poor upbringing. So what I'd want you to do is consider how Doyle might be using him as a representative of the poor working classes. And with that, you may want to think about, is Doyle in any way not excusing his crimes, but is he giving some kind of reason or justification for why Jonathan Small might have got involved in a crime to do with treasure? So just have a think about that. Okay, I'm sure you can read through these points yourselves, but just to sum up then the context that you would link to an essay on setting. So Victorian London was heavily industrial, so we had this constant smog and gloom in the atmosphere, which we see in the novella. Second point, Gothic literature of the 19th century did favour these gloomy and dark settings to set this mysterious mood. Third point, the blind faith and ignorance of previous eras where everybody just believed in God and accepted that certain things happened because God intended them to. That belief was being replaced by science and knowledge and enlightenment. And again, we see that through Holmes's method of the science of deduction and this idea that light was being shed on topics that previously hadn't been understood properly. We also see, for context, that there's a stark divide between the wealthy and the poor in London. So Doyle seems to expose that. We see that population was growing disproportionately, so it was growing really rapidly, and that resulted in lots of poverty and crime. Okay, so it's always very important to consider what the writer's intentions might have been. So remember to use your tentative language here, so possibly Doyle might have intended, etc. Okay, so some of the ideas that I've put forward, perhaps then, by presenting the setting in the way he did, he wanted to set the mood for a mysterious detective story, so using that pathetic fallacy and that motif of fog and gloom. Perhaps he wanted to expose some of the social inequalities in Victorian London, so to show the unfairness in the differences between the rich and the poor. And finally, perhaps he wanted to symbolise the transition in 19th century society from ignorance and blind faith to knowledge, scientific advancement and enlightenment. So again, this idea of moving from the gloom into the light. Okay, so as usual, we've given you an essay-based question. So what is the importance of setting in the novella The Sign of the Four? So please use as much of the information that we've gone through today as possible. So the minimum expectations, as you know, is to create one paragraph and send that to your teacher by Friday the 3rd of July. In red there, it just tells you, it reminds you to talk about the assessment objectives. If you do want to push yourself, you can write the full essay and send that to your teacher. Okay, so based on what we've learned today through the PowerPoint, just check your answers. And hopefully you will have got all 5 of them correct. Okay, well done Year 10, you've completed the lesson on setting. So obviously there'll be another lesson uploaded next week. Enjoy.